This lecture that I'm going to give was inspired by reading the book by the eminent Dominican theologian Aidan Nichols, who wrote a very fine study entitled The Theology of Pope Benedict XVI. 400 pages. 4 pages were devoted to moral theology. And so I decided to try to fill them in. In 1998, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger traveled to England to give the annual Fisher Lecture for the Catholic Chaplaincy at Cambridge University. The title of his paper was Consumer Materialism and Christian Hope, suggesting that he would come prepared to speak about problems like drugs and AIDS and terrorism, uncontroversial material for a prelate giving a public lecture. At first, Ratzinger, by the way, I'm going to refer to him as Ratzinger, politely tried to give that kind of an after-dinner speech. A few minutes later, he abruptly changed course, proposing, quote, "What is moral has lost its evidence." And I quote. Now, the concept of a personal relationship between God, the Creator, and each individual person is certainly not missing from the religious and moral history of humanity, although it's limited in its pure form to the realm of biblical religion. Yet, what was first of all common to all of pre-modern mankind lies along this self-same line. That is, the conviction that in man's being there lies an imperative. The conviction that man does not devise morality by calculating expediencies. Rather, he comes upon it in the nature of things. So, as it happened, Cardinal Ratzinger had come to give a lecture on natural law. And he put the question of evidence, lost and found, into a context where it was once found. The common patrimony and primeval testimony of wisdom traditions, which in different ways and with different emphases affirmed the necessary harmony between human existence and the message of nature, to use Ratzinger's own language. Here in Cambridge, he was revisiting a theme famously developed by the thinker, the writer, former resident of Magdalen College, Cambridge, C.S. Lewis. That is, the abolition of man, written in the middle of World War II, with its well-known appendix of universal moral propositions modeled on the Chinese Tao. And here is one of them. The grand developments of Greece and of the Near and Far East, about which we have been speaking, have forfeited nothing in terms of the validity which lies at the heart of their assertions. We may look upon them now, however, as tributaries which flow toward the grand river of Christianity. Actually, the moral vision of the Christian faith is not something particularly Christian. It is rather a synthesis of the great moral intuitions of humanity from a new center which holds them together. What Christianity has in common with the other wisdom traditions he gathered is the conviction, quote, morality is not man's prison, rather it's what's divine in him, and found across traditions. This is not only an ethical but also an anthropological conviction, namely that the human person is open to reality as a whole. Were this not true, the order of nature would amount to a mere aggregation of details, and our interpretation of these details would be restricted to the domain of scientific materialism. Other evidences might count, but only as partial constructions of various subjectivities, social, political, and legal. And on that score, morality really would be a prison. And whatever is divine in man would demand to be emancipated from the prison of mere cultural partialities, which can force and cajole but only pretend to bind conduct. Thus, for the modern person, he concluded, morality has lost its evidence. We can see through all things but not see. There he's quoting C.S. Lewis. Christianity, he proposed, has no point of entry into dialogue with that cultural world, which recognizes only one objective universal, scientific materialism. But the good news is that Christianity does know how to dialogue with other moral traditions that have an odos, a way, a road, a Tao, a Dharma, some pathway of evidence, so to speak. Now, this Cambridge paper in 1988 turned out to be rather important. It ends up influencing two very important encyclicals by John Paul II, and I'm going to return to it later. For now, I should point out something surprising about the Cambridge lecture. As far as I can tell, it was the first time that Joseph Ratzinger, speaking in his own name and in the office of theologian, publicly addressed the issue of natural law. And you ask, how could that be so? He was at the top of his game when he gave it. He had never addressed it before. So here's a few reasons to explain that, and why perhaps Aidan Nichols only included 4 pages in his study, The Theology of Benedict XVI. When Ratzinger entered the world of academic theology, well, first of all, he enters in 1951, first writing a dissertation on Augustine's ecclesiology at the University of Munich, and then his habilitation on Bonaventure's theology of history and revelation. But when he entered that world of academic theology, the brighter students were channeled into dogmatic, scriptural, and historical theology. Moral theology was not regarded as a speculative and synthetic discipline that tackled big and interesting theological problems. By and large, moral theology in the Catholic world was taught and studied by way of manuals and cases, ultimately to serve priests dealing with issues of law and conscience in the confessional. To be sure, it had a natural law foundation, but it was not tailored either to a full philosophy nor to sacred scripture. Moral theology was a half-lit moon in the firmament of theology. By the way, the students who weren't good enough to go into dogmatics and scripture, but who were ambitious, went into canon law, but that's always been true. Sorry, Dick. Had Ratzinger entered academic theology 10 years later, the picture would have looked entirely different. The sexual and biomedical issues had come to the fore by the late 1950s, and by the late 1960s, sexuality and conscience occupied the center ring, the center stage of theology. Indeed, moral theology reinvented itself as a speculative and virtually a freestanding discipline that treated ethical theories rather than cases and laws. Years later, Ratzinger would write, and I quote, "The post-conciliar aim was to go beyond natural law in order to recover a deeper biblical inspiration, and yet it was precisely this new moral theology that ended up by marginalizing sacred scripture even more completely than the pre-conciliar manualist tradition." He adds, "The specialist debate in current moral theology spins around deontological and teleological theories, becoming ever more remote from either the order of creation or redemption. Rather than reforming this casuitical legalism of the old days that operated on the margins of serious philosophy and theology, moral theology had become ethical theories detached from traditions." By the way, that quote is 4 years before McIntyre's After Virtue. So Ratzinger was on that path fairly early on. At the same time, the pastoral elements of the Second Vatican Council seemed to nudge the older speculative theological disciplines in the direction of praxis. I remember I was there. Modern theology, for instance, sacramental theology, became liturgical praxis. Ratzinger suggested that the modern age is marked by a shift away from any concern for what is true to a concern only for what can be done or made. And in the mid-1970s, he admonished theologians not to cooperate in reason's capitulation in the face of almighty praxis. In effect, by the 60s, Joseph Ratzinger's world of academic theology had been turned upside down. Systematic theology now aspires to become praxis, and moral theology to become theory. And well into the 1970s, while at the peak of his academic career, he wrote and spoke extensively on the problems in systematic theology. But he postponed reckoning with moral theology. And that would change in 1981, when he became prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. Now, no longer just an academic theologian, he's an ecclesial theologian, and questions of moral theology were unavoidable. Now, I use the plural legacies of Joseph Ratzinger because there are different contexts in which a theologian has to reckon with the natural law component of moral theology. A few years back, Alistair MacIntyre made a very astute observation about the relationship between natural law and revealed theology. This is MacIntyre. It's not just that natural law can be known by the exercise of the powers of reason, independently of revelation, but also that the knowledge of divine law afforded by revelation presupposes a prior knowledge of the precepts of the natural law. It is a revealed truth, that is to say, that the truths of natural law can be known prior to and independently of any revealed truths, including this particular revealed truth. And so, one could say, apropos of MacIntyre's point, even if the institutions of a given culture, universities, courts, the media, other churches and religions, had no further use of natural law, either as a supposition or as an explanatory framework, the church nevertheless would be bound to teach and affirm the natural law, both as doctrine and as philosophical infrastructure. Therefore, theologians presuppose a source of evidence that is not per se revealed by the gospel, but is also the gospel that requires them to recognize it. It's really a double presupposition: evidence open to everyone and evidence included in the gospel, forming an organic part of moral theology. Let's call these contexts for reckoning with natural law. And I can think of three. I'm tailoring these to what Ratzinger ends up working on. The first is systematic. The systematic theologian works with the presupposition of natural law in terms of the economies of creation and redemption. With respect to creation, the theologian considers the human being as an image bearer, capacitated to know the good, and thus to be provident for himself and for others. There I am quoting Aquinas' famous definition of natural law. This is the doctrine of participation. However important it is that the acts of a truth-seeking image bearer are assimilated and purified by the gospel, there is a natural habitat of reason. So put, the systematic theologian is not immediately concerned to make moral arguments, but rather to render coherent these plural sources of truth. But there's another way that the theologian has to deal with natural law. The first is systematic, and its goal is coherence. The second is, I call, dialectical. This is the province of moral theology strictly defined. We begin with a disputed question. The mind works dialectically from common premises and authorities to fully practical conclusions about sexual conduct, biomedical practices, warfare, fundamental rights, and so forth. The third, I'll call dialogical. That's the search for common premises across religions and philosophical traditions. As Ratzinger put it in his Cambridge lecture, dialogue is a search for common and converging pathways of evidence. This evening, I'm most interested in this last one, the dialogical. But in order to assess it, I have to say a few words about the first two. That is, the systematic, and a little bit on the dialectical. Ratzinger was a systematic theologian, all the way down to his toenails. And in those days, perhaps even today, a systematic theologian reflects upon the sources of revelation and the ordered inquiries and expositions belonging to theology proper, which is revealed theology. These include the orders of creation and redemption, Christology, Trinity, ecclesiology, sacraments, and yes, even moral theology. But the purpose of systematics is coherence of truths. In the Catholic tradition, this kind of work includes the infrastructure of philosophy brought to bear on these ordered inquiries and expositions of sacred doctrine. In his first encyclical as Pope, for example, Deus Caritas Est, 2005, Ratzinger insisted that the human being made unto the image and likeness of God, that becomes by grace imago Christi, is not simply a matter of morality. He means to say that the real distinction between creator and creature, the orders of creation and redemption and divine providence, the relationship between nature and grace, are not established by moral theology. Rather, they're presupposed by moral theology, especially the nature of the human creature, the scope and dignity of conscience, the relationship between human reason to first truth and to divine providence. Therefore, the subject of natural law does not belong exhaustively or exclusively, or even in the first place to moral theology. It belongs to systematics, along with all of the anthropology and other things presupposed. Hence, Ratzinger's long-standing criticism of the older casuitical manualist tradition, as well as his criticism of the more recent bid of moral theology to become ethical theory detached from theology. His generation, coming of age in the 1940s, wanted to repristinate theology by returning to scripture, patrology, monastic mysticism, and to do so by giving more attention to historical rather than scholastic methods. These were called ressourcement theologians. And most of them believed that scholasticism carried a germ of rationalism. And for his part, Ratzinger, who was a ressourcement theologian and a critic of rationalism, set himself apart from his generational cohort because he was a staunch defender of the creative encounter of Christian faith and philosophy. We go all the way back to his inaugural lecture at the University of Bonn, 1959, when he became an ordinarius of fundamental theology. Follow through all the subsequent decades of his books and essays, finally to his famous Regensburg address, right the year after he was elected Pope. Ratzinger refused in no uncertain terms to equate ressourcement with de-Hellenization. De-Hellenization, in that place and time, stands for the endeavor to emancipate or to purify revealed doctrine by evacuating what it had taken from philosophy, as well as other Greco-Roman patterns of thought, including law, politics, and art. De-Hellenization crossed denominational boundaries in theology, and depending upon the particular theologian, it could imply either something very conservative or a very progressive theological agenda. The best summary of de-Hellenization was given by Ratzinger himself in his address at Regensburg. In fact, it was the core of his lecture, unfortunately obscured in the controversy over his remarks about Islam. So here in kind of bullet points is Ratzinger's scheme. Looking at the tradition of scholastic theology, the reformers taught that they were confronted with a faith system totally conditioned by philosophy, that is to say, an articulation of the faith based upon an alien system of thought. As a result, faith no longer appeared as a living historical word, but just one element of an overarching philosophical system. And when Kant later stated that he needed to set thinking aside in order to make room for faith, he carried this program forward with a radicalism that the reformers could never have foreseen. But there's another de-Hellenization. He calls it the liberal version of the 19th and 20th centuries. Adolf von Harnack, perhaps being the primary figure in this movement, the central idea of this was to return simply to the man Jesus and his simple message. Underneath all of the accretions of theology and Hellenization, and this simple message was seen as the culmination of the religious development of humanity. Jesus put an end to worship in favor of morality. And then there was the neo-Orthodox reaction against the liberals, but also sharing the imperative of de-Hellenization. Karl Barth sharpened the program for de-Hellenization against the presence of philosophy in theology. As Barth saw it, the natural law and even the Ten Commandments, all the common moral truths of the Gentiles, can confront each other only in pure paradox. And then Ratzinger laid out in Regensburg the final stage of de-Hellenization, which is the one he thought going on today. It's called cultural pluralism. That is, the early church synthesized itself with Hellenistic patterns of thought as an initial enculturation, but they're not binding upon future cultures. These future cultures, the one we live in today, are said to have a right to return to the simple message of the New Testament prior to that enculturation in order to enculturate it anew in their own particular milieu. Okay. And Ratzinger said, the first de-Hellenization regards philosophy as a form of thought alien to faith. The second one regards philosophy as alien both to the humanitarian praxis of Christianity and to modern science. The third regards philosophy as antichrist, or a false religion altogether. And the fourth regards culture as superior to philosophy, ethos over logos. Ratzinger refused to go down these rabbit holes. For one thing, he contended that they misunderstood the emergence of Christian theology. And here I quote, "From the beginning, Christianity understood itself as a religion of the logos, as the religion according to reason. In the first place, it has not identified its precursors as the other religions, but rather its precursors was the philosophical enlightenment, which cleared the path of traditions to search for truth, to the one God who is above other gods. Ancient Christian art," he pointed out, and he did in Spe Salvi, in the beginning of his encyclical Spe Salvi as well, depicts Christ as the philosopher. The prototype of the Homo Christianus is the philosopher. For another thing, Ratzinger says sacred scripture does not lay out a complete system of ethics, but rather presupposes a common morality and purifies it. Scripture itself, he said, is a path, a history of multiple readings which converge upon Christ, but this path presupposes other paths, including common moral truths. In the third place, he contended, Christianity defends philosophy because it needs it. Rather than demanding closure, Christianity encourages faith-seeking understanding and reason-seeking enlightenment. The universality of faith, which is the basic presupposition of the Christian gospel, is both meaningful and morality defensible only if faith is oriented beyond the symbolism of religions toward an answer meant for all. That is, to a universal beyond cultural diversity. And so to dismiss Christianity's assimilation of ancient paths of the Logos does not purify the gospel, it simply amputates its roots in the natural habitat of reason. We could say much more, but this is how Ratzinger found his groove with regard to natural law. He didn't go through the front door of moral theology, nor was he instigated by any particular moral dilemma, nor did he get there by studying and reconsidering Thomas's presentation of human action in the Secunda Pars of the Summa. Instead, he found his way to the topic of natural law as a systematic theologian. I think it's a rather unique story in our time, actually. After he took that position as prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, he then had to do something he had never done before. He had to render judgment, verdicts, on disputed issues of moral theology. And I call this dialectical because the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith is called upon to resolve disputed issues. Some are in sacraments, other in disciplines, but a lot of them in morals. And in this position, Ratzinger, as prefect, would propose the topic, he would assign the team to work on it, and he signed the finished product. Many, not all of these documents, several dozen of them, fell squarely in the area of moral theology. It's impossible here for me to give a properly detailed account of all these documents because they treat such a diversity of issues. Just for example, document in 1986 on liberty of conscience, arguing that history does not constitute a moral law or a norm proximate to the act of conscience. 1987, gift of life, a treatment of in vitro fertilization, heterologous fertilization. 1993 on sterilization, 2003 on the legal recognition of homosexual persons, 2002 on the participation of Catholics in public life. Moreover, he was orchestrating the International Theological Commission, which really answers to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, to undertake important studies on the dignity and rights of human persons, 1983, and human persons created in the image of God in 2004. And all I wish to say about these documents is that none of them are rationalistic in the fashion of the manuals or canonical verdicts. They all display a keen attention to multiple premises drawn both from faith and reason and engage complex lines of reasoning. During these decades at the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, the important story, for Ratzinger anyway, is that the Holy See was at work quietly on two encyclicals, each bearing upon the natural law from different directions. The first is Veritatis Splendor, which was issued in 1993, and the second, Fides et Ratio, 1998. They're crucial for understanding Ratzinger's legacies. Let me give a little bit of background of that. Some of you are old enough to remember. In 1963, 50 years ago, John the 23rd issued his encyclical Pacem in Terris. Rhetorically, it was a most extravagant appeal to natural law as grounding some 25 discrete rights. Inside and outside of the church, there was hardly a murmur of complaint. Bring it on, sounds good. The Pope had basically taken the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights and had laid it out in language of natural law. By the way, the word sex was used only once, and it was in reference to equality in the workplace. 3 years later, Pope Paul VI issued Humanae Vitae, which made a rather terse natural law argument against contraception. It immediately met with the most severe disapproval, both by Catholics and non-Catholics. And what made the event all the more embarrassing was that the encyclical was addressed to all men of goodwill. The teaching was not just politely ignored, but resisted. And for his part, Paul VI would live for 10 more years and never write another encyclical. Many, if not most people, rejected the natural law argument of Humani Vitae on what I would call the simplest ground, that is, the conclusion that contraception for whatever purpose is malum in se. It seemed completely implausible. Criticism from those who are more learned in philosophy and theology rejected the premises on the ground that terms like nature and law were used equivocally with regard to both moral and physical or biological aspects of law. Still others, mostly in the Catholic Church, complained that the Pope had flaunted the recommendation of the majority of his own committee. And so it was a perfect storm. A natural law argument rejected on its conclusions, rejected on its premises, and rejected as contradicting not only the opinion of experts, but the sensus fidelium of the people. The most striking thing, however, was that even those who agreed with the position of Humani Vitae understood that it exposed a weakness in Catholic moral theology, especially regarding the natural law component. Joseph Ratzinger and Karl Wojtyła were among that group. They saw the weakness. And in fact, the weakness could be detected on the surface of the document. It was rather short, 1/5 the length of Pacem in Terris. Its entire treatment of matrimonial acts amounted to not even 500 words. It had the appearance of a verdict issued in the fashion of the older manualist and casuitical method. There was almost no theology, or philosophy, or anthropology. References to Scripture were almost entirely decorative, except, ominously, the Pope's reference to Luke 2 at the end of the encyclical. Quote, "But it comes as no surprise to the Church that she, no less than her divine founder, is destined to be a sign of contradiction." So it was understood all around the Horn that the use of natural law had to be reconsidered. Not just the issue of contraception, but natural law. And Ratzinger brought two things to that task. First, his longstanding suspicion that moral theology was legalistic, rationalist, and situated not just in the suburbs, but the exurbs of theology. And secondly, his resistance to theological currents that wanted to evacuate a higher tradition of logos. For his part, John Paul II, Wojtyła, brought expertise in philosophical and theological anthropology and much else besides. An interesting fact. After his election, John Paul II went on to give 129 conferences, amounting to 160,000 words, on the very topic that Humani Vitae tersely attempted to cover in a mere 2 paragraphs. So this long slog from 63 into the 80s moved toward 2 encyclicals. Veritatis, issued in 93, took 6 years to write. Fides et Ratio, issued in 1998, took at least 6 years. I have some evidence that it took 12. Going all the way back to the birth of modern magisterial teaching via encyclicals, back to the mid-19th century, no previous encyclicals took so long to write as these two. Veritatis turned to the question of what kind of component natural law is in moral theology, and how it relates to the other sources of doctrine, sacred scripture, Christology, theological anthropology, ascetical theology, and ecclesiology. Its subtitle is On Fundamental Questions, rather than fully practical ones. And the encyclical set out, a rather long encyclical, to give a more nuanced account of the natural law assumptions used by the magisterium. And I'm not going to make an effort to summarize this very rich encyclical, but it did insist that natural law forms an organic part of moral theology. in the fashion of MacIntyre's comment. It explains that moral truths, in principle accessible to human reason, not only constitute a preparation for the gospel, but are situated within it. The moral law, thus understood, is presupposed in the two ways of moral theology. Principles of moral order derived from human nature, those same principles as clarified and integrated in the teachings of Christ. And the encyclical said, the magisterium does not bring to the Christian conscience truths which are extraneous to it. Rather, it brings to light truths which it ought already to possess. Important, too, was the encyclical's emphasis on the ethics of the human being as an image bearer. The created image bearer participates in God's wisdom and providence, a primary theme of St. Thomas's natural law theory. But remarkably, just here, where theology and the philosophical aspects of natural law most deeply interact, Humanae Vitae was entirely silent. The word providence is used but once in Humanae Vitae. And imagine an encyclical on procreation failing to deal with the image and likeness, given that the ethic of procreation is situated right in that very passage of Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply. Switching now to Fides et Ratio, it's the first encyclical since Leo XIII that systematically treats faith and reason. Ratzinger's imprint on this document was profound. That 1988 Cambridge lecture is brought back by direct quotation and paraphrase throughout the document. The punchline was that FR, for Fides et Ratio, stood for Ratzinger in Fisichella, that's Reno Fisichella, who at the time was a consultant to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. If you look at chapter 4 of Fides et Ratio, it's all on the patristic appropriation of wisdom traditions. Ratzinger's hand there was directly. And the word search is used more than 60 times to characterize the relationship between faith and reason. That 1988 Cambridge lecture runs like dotted lines through Fides et Ratio. And I say that Ratzinger left the tradition, the Catholic uses of natural law, better off than he found it, even though he was not a moral theologian. The estate of moral theology and its presentation of natural law was immeasurably better than it was in 1953 when Ratzinger began his formal academic studies. And most people do not appreciate this steady process of upgrading that was funneled into and expressed by those two encyclicals on the subject of natural law. And I suspect this is due to the fact that the learned and the vulgar alike only look at the conclusions. And the moral conclusions didn't change at all, or at least not very much, from 1953 to 2013 on questions of marriage, sex, life, and death. If you're just looking at the conclusions, you're not going to see much difference. But boy, if you look at how they're written and thought through, and regardless of what you think about the conclusions, the Catholic presentation of natural law, at least the magisterial part of it, had steadily become supple and deep. No minimalist ethic of manualists. They show a complexity of sources, a complexity of reasons for moral teaching. It describes natural law not just as a set of conclusions, but as a search and a path, and a wonderful complexity of exposition, accessing scripture, dogmatics, and philosophy. So this, thus far, in somewhat broad strokes, I've just surveyed the first two contexts in which Catholic theology uses natural law. One is systematically, relocating it in anthropology, economies of creation, redemption, and so forth, and then dialectical. Ratzinger had a great hand in that, but he also left it in a quandary. And so let me conclude with what the quandary is. The quandary, indeed, was in view during the year leading up to and the year following his election to the papacy in the spring of 2005. I'm going to briefly flag 3 papers that represented that Cambridge lecture Rita Vivas. 2004, Cardinal Ratzinger has a much celebrated exchange with Jürgen Habermas, published in 2005 under the title The Dialectics of Secularization. Ratzinger's own essay, interestingly, was titled The Pre-Political Moral Foundations of a Free State. He proposed reasonable people will agree that the moral foundations of human law cannot be up for a vote, carried by a majority, that there are values that flow from the essence of what it means to be a human person. And then he says, this is in response to Habermas. The natural law has remained, especially in the Catholic Church, the key issue in dialogues with secular society and with other communities of faith, in order to appeal to the reason we share in common and to seek the basis of a consensus about the ethical principles of law in a secular, pluralistic society. Unfortunately, this instrument has become blunt, this instrument being natural law. Accordingly, I do not intend to appeal to it for support in this conversation. The idea of natural law presupposed a concept of nature in which nature and reason overlap, since nature itself is rational. This view of nature has capsized, capovolta, turned over. It's a startling remark. And what did he mean to say? In the Western tradition, natural law ethics dependent upon a distinction between nature and convention. Right? At Standard, you learn it in college, the phusis nomos distinction. And in the ancient world, the opponents of the sophists contended that the human bestrides both nature and convention, but the rational, or what Aristotelians might call the specific difference, rational animal, is rooted in the natural, not the convention. And only thus can nature be a norm as against convention. For the post-Enlightenment secular world, however, the distinction is capsized, turned upside down, with the result that the specifically human stands in the domain of convention, that is, cultures, human laws, and values, which are missing from nature, and thus the ought cannot belong to the habitat of the natural. Ratzinger was saying that either we are not speaking of the same thing, or, however politely, we're just contradicting one another. He made the same point in a speech to the German Bundestag. The idea of, I'm quoting, the idea of natural law today is viewed as a specifically Catholic doctrine, not worth bringing into the discussion in a non-Catholic environment, so that I feel almost ashamed to even mention the term. Another startling comment. Ashamed? Why? Because the natural today signifies the proto-human, what awaits humanization in the domain of culture and values, in convention. It would seem shameful then to speak of human freedom and rationality as natural. That essay, by the way, came out just when he was elected Pope. And one day, the day before John Paul II died, Ratzinger gave a very lengthy paper at St. Scholastica's convent, original convent at Subiaco. Of all of his replays of the 1988 Cambridge lecture, this is probably the best. And I'll very quickly get to the quandary and end this. The Enlightenment he proposed was a Logos tradition that was not only in dialogue with Christianity, but helped Christianity to appreciate more deeply its own tradition of reason. And here's the central passage. The Enlightenment is of Christian origin, and it is no accident that it was born precisely and exclusively in the realm of Christian faith. Whenever Christianity, against its nature, and unfortunately, had it become a religion of the state, a religion of convention, Notwithstanding the philosophy, insofar as the search for rationality is also of our faith, was always a prerogative of Christianity, and the voice of reason had been too domesticated. It was and is the merit of the Enlightenment to have again proposed these original values of Christianity and has given back to us reason in its own voice. Unquote. In fact, he singled out Hugo Grotius' famous dictum about the natural moral law. Common moral norms must be true, valid even if God did not exist. And Ratzinger praises Grotius for this. Quote, in the opposition of the confessions and in the crises of religious wars, an attempt was made to keep the essential values of morality outside the contradictions and to seek for them an evidence that would render them independent of the many divisions and uncertainties of the different philosophies and confessions. In this way, the Enlightenment wanted to ensure the basis of coexistence and, in general, the foundation of humanity, unquote. This is typically paradoxical Ratzinger. Enlightenment is not secularism. Rather, secularism is the Enlightenment after it evacuates its wisdom or logos tradition, leaving us with only one universal, which is the science of matter, and all the rest has to be thrown to convention and culture. Amazingly, the Church's appeal in modern times to natural law in the public forum had always assumed the Enlightenment. And it's this assumption that can no longer hold. It's been capsized. Finally, we come to the search for a universal ethics. As prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, Ratzinger gave the topic to the International Theological Commission in 2004, just when he's working on his exchange with Habermas. And that commission labored for 2 years, 2006 to 2008. In the meantime, of course, the prefect had become Benedict XVI. The final product was produced in 2009. It was signed by Cardinal Prefect, who was then prefect of the congregation, but it's Ratzinger to the bone, this document. The commission, its study, endeavors to orient and enrich dialogue outside of the immediate environs of moral theology. Quote, in this document, we intend to invite all who ask themselves about the ultimate foundations of ethics and of the juridical and political order to consider the resources that a renewed presentation of the teaching of natural law contains. So, the search, as I'm going to call the document, treats natural law in the light of what the Catholic tradition has cumulatively discovered and formulated over the centuries, including a long list of the defects and shortcomings in Catholic presentation of natural law. On this score, for example, the Commission notes recurring problems of emphasizing too strongly the biological at the expense of freedom, of having in other ways emphasized too strongly reason to the point of rationalism, of having made anthropological assumptions that needed to be adjusted in view of historical and cultural context, of suggesting that the precepts of natural law are some already assembled system. So the search approaches natural law, claiming no more authority than being one wisdom tradition among others, albeit the Catholic one having centuries of experience in this field of inquiry. Wisdom traditions, according to the document, recognize and make explicit in different ways that there's a common patrimony of moral values, that certain moral actions are required by human nature itself, and that human nature stands in a creative and harmonious relation to the cosmological and metaphysical order that surpasses it and gives it life. Wisdom traditions, in other words, are open to reality as a whole. And in fact, the whole first part of the document is titled Convergences. It begins with the 1948 UN Declaration, which it praises, but then goes on to criticize. It says, we now in a situation in which there are no wisdom traditions to ground or to have pathways of evidence into the propositions of the Declaration. The search is at pains to say it does not mean by dialogue either the Habermasian or Rawlsian methods for reaching norms mutually acceptable simply by modes of discussion and procedure. It eschews dialogue that's a purely inductive search on a parliamentary model of some minimally existing consent. It calls this dialogue without a search. And as it remarks, dialogue in the secular domain has not proven adequate either to secure foundations for the post-1948 Human Rights Project or to win the support of religions and wisdom traditions which do not want to discourse on the basis of a minimal ethic. The search envisages a dialogue rather different than what we mean by public reason. Rather than holding back one's best considered reasons, it puts a mature line of reasons on the table and inviting other wisdom traditions to do the same. And it regards inquiry in natural law as an apprenticeship out of a wisdom. So, here's the question. How is this orientation to work with dialogues with the secularists? What Ratzinger has called enlightenment without roots, or the wisdom tradition capsized. In our culture, there are no moral messages in the nature of things. In our culture, what is immanent is not a system of semiotics. Nature is not a semiotic. It's not a set of messages or a book or a ladder in the sense that we have inherited from St. Paul or Bonaventure or Thomas Aquinas. The immanent, rather, is the domain of freedom, just for the reason that it does not require transcendent messages, much less messages that arrive so intimately with authority. The immanent, for all practical purposes, is nothing other than what is bereft of, or still waiting for authority. And so when the International Theological Commission expresses the urgent need to reach common foundations of the natural law sort for the Human Rights Project, it's going to have to anticipate a response which on its own view is terribly inadequate, if not irrational. Namely, that public reason gives reasons for rights that must prescind, as Rawls himself would say, from the whole truth. It looks as though the Ratzingerian line that worked so well in the first two contexts, the systematic context and the in-house dialectical context, has set up a situation that would make dialogue with the secular world, the real secular world, almost impossible. And the ITC document, in a way, recognizes that. In section 35, it outlines 4 dialogical uses by the Church of natural law. Let me just briefly mention them and see which ones might actually be dialogical. First, facing the spread of a culture that limits rationality to the positive sciences and abandons the moral life to relativism, it insists on the natural capacity of the human being to obtain by reason the ethical message contained in being. That sounds like it might be dialogical. That is, it might be a convergence of evidences. In the second place, I'm quoting now, in the presence of relativistic individualism, which judges that every individual is the source of his own values, and that society results from mere contract. This is not dialogical. This is maybe dialectical if they shared common premises. In the third place, Facing an aggressive secularism that wants to exclude believers from the public debate, the Church points out that interventions of Christians in public life on subjects that regard natural law are not in themselves confessional in nature. That's not dialogical, that's apologetical. And finally, the Church recalls that civil laws that do not bind conscience when they contradict natural law, and asks for acknowledgement of the right of conscientious objection, as well as the duty of disobedience in the name of obedience to higher law. That's purely defensive. So of the 4 uses the Commission comes up with, only one looks like dialogue. The other 3 look vis-a-vis secularism as either apologetical or purely defensive in nature. So here's my conclusion. The Church very intelligently and faithfully adjusts the dialogical context of natural law discourse to correspond to the deeper upgrade that's already been given to it in the systematic and dialectical functions, especially with regard to those encyclicals. The natural law treatment had become more robust, more complex, more integrated with theology proper. And so the Church seems to have answered Ratzinger's question. Here was his question commissioning that document: how to find constructive pointers in convergences for an effective deepening of the doctrine on the natural moral law. And the answer is, not surprisingly, Ratzinger's own answer. The post-Enlightenment has capsized, turned upside down, the distinction between nature and convention. And if that be true, the only dialogical path can be interreligious dialogue, so far as I can tell. All of the other uses of this are not dialogical, they're defensive or apologetical. Is this what Ratzinger was looking for? It's certainly one of his legacies. And it may be true, it actually may be true, that natural law, in the way the Catholic tradition has understood it, and as it's understood how other wisdom traditions has understood it, is only to be undertaken in the form of interreligious dialogue. And that is a quandary, and it's not Ratzinger's alone. Thank you.